Okay, we are live and in the studios. So if everybody can have a seat and get ready. So for the next 13 weeks, we will study the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. Now we're going to have various members of the congregation or the church come in and teach or lead the class each week. And in the first couple weeks, we're going to bounce around a little bit. We're going to look at 1 Kings chapter 3, and then jump to 10 and 11. Then next week, we'll go back to do 5 through 9. And then Eric will do the third week, and he'll start with chapter 12. So the first couple weeks, we're going to bounce around a little bit. Then it'll kind of be a little more a normal progression after that. So it's a little different than we've had recently. Kevin, thank you for a great session that you did. It's beyond my comprehension. Now you can get so detailed and have so much knowledge, so we appreciate you. So let's get rolling here. The 1 Kings is where we're going to start today. These two books were originally one book, the Book of Kings. It's not known exactly who wrote it. The consensus that I could figure out is written by Jeremiah. There are some other thoughts that maybe it was written by more than one person, Ezra perhaps, Ezekiel might have been involved. But because the style of the writing, most of the scholars I was able to figure out thought that it was written by a single person, and it was thought to be Jeremiah, but nobody really knows for sure. Now, Kings covers about 400 years of Israelite history, and it was probably written in the Babylonian exile, which is after the fall of Israel to the Babylonians around 550 to 560 BC. Both books talk about the same kind of thing. They talk about the fate of the monarchy in Israel after the death of David. And in 1 Kings, the first 2 chapters actually discuss the death of David. We're not going to get into that. We're going to jump into book 3. But the purpose of the Kings in general is to provide a theological exploration for the destruction of the kingdom by the Babylonians, and to provide maybe a foundation for a return of this exile. So when we start thinking about this is written when the author is in exile after the fall of Israel in 560 BC or so. Book 1, or 1 Kings, generally starts with the death of David, like I said. Then it talks about King Solomon, and the next 2 weeks we'll do King Solomon. And then it follows the rest of the kings through the beginning of the fall around 930 BC. The second book starts after the collapse until about 586 BC. So basically that's where we get how this happens. We're going to learn in the next 13 weeks about the fall of Israel, directly related to the apostasy of the kings. And the author has a constant theme here that they're hopeful that the people will be restored to the glory that they had under King David. So let's jump right into 1 Kings chapter 3. We're going to start with that, where Solomon asked for wisdom. Now Solomon was made king. He was not the firstborn son. That wasn't necessarily the absolute on who in the right of succession. But if you recall, there was a deal basically with David and Bathsheba about who was going to take over the kingdom, and Solomon was decided that he would become the next, or it would be determined that Solomon would become the next king. Now during this time, Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought it to the city of David until he finished building the palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were still sacrificing at the high places because the temple had not yet been built in the name of the Lord. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the instructions given to him by his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burned incenses on the high places. So it starts off telling us that Solomon is true to God and he's going to do the right things. He's going to follow in David's footsteps. But we're going to start to see, and we saw this when we talked about weeks ago or months ago when I talked about Abraham and Jacob, the problems that we're going to start to see when foreign people come involved, when intermarriage starts happening. And we'll see that later on this morning about the effects of that. So it's interesting how the very first talk about Solomon here talks about his marriage to Pharaoh's daughter. So the king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place, and Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings at the altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream and said, "Ask for whatever you want from me to give you." So let's first talk about the whole concept at the time, the way people were acting. People were still offering their sacrifices. There was no temple to do so at that time. Solomon goes to Gibeon to do a sacrifice at the altar there. That was called the Great High Place. The tabernacle was there. If you remember, the ark had been moved to Jerusalem, but there had been no temple there. So the people were worshiping more at Gibeon at the time at the Great High Place. And then a dream comes along. God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." So Solomon answers, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on this throne this very day. Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" So we have this dream. We have God asking what he can give. And what is asked for? Firstly, before that, what does God offer? What's God offering here? Whatever you want. Yeah, whatever you want. This is a pretty bold offer here. Any thoughts why? Why would God just decide to offer whatever? I'll give you whatever you want here.
I find it very powerful because it says Solomon loved the Lord, yet he gave sacrifices in the high places, which was wrong, right?
Yes.
And Solomon asked for all this stuff, and yet he still kept marrying the other women, which that was wrong in the sight of God, wasn't it?
It was, yes.
That's hard to understand.
Rick? Okay, testing his heart. Okay. So the answer is, does he pass the test? Does he pass the test with what he asked for? He asked for a hearing heart or a discerning heart, one that would listen to God. He understands his role here. He's not saying, "I can't do this job." But he understands this is a big job, ruling these people, and I must rely on God. He asks simply, "Help me to figure out the difference between good and evil." So what does he ask for? He asks for he asks for wisdom, but he doesn't say, give me wisdom. He says, give me the ability to figure things out, to listen to you. Right.
It's interesting, as a king, why does he care? I mean, it's almost like he's got a different view of his role. His role is to be more like a judge, it sounds like, judging between the people like Moses did, as opposed to being king, almighty and do whatever you want, dictatorial. Just come to mind.
Yeah, I'm guessing that the kings did act as judge from time to time. I mean, I assume that was one of their roles, is they had to decide, and they would bring people and they would take care of deciding who was right and who was wrong. Solomon kind of did know his role. He wrote, of course, in Proverbs 4, he talks about his father David and what he taught him. He says, he taught me, and he said to me, take hold of my words with all your heart, keep my commands, and you will live. Get wisdom, get understanding. Do not forget my words or turn away from them. Do not forsake wisdom, and she will protect you. Love her, and she will watch over you. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. Though it costs all you have, get wisdom. Cherish her, she will exalt you. Embrace her, and she will honor you. So he had been taught by his father, basically David, that wisdom was important. That was one of the things he's needing. So he asks a couple things here. He asks the ability to discern right from wrong and to understand that he needs God's help, right? So was God pleased with this? The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have you asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in obedience to me and keep my decrees and commands as David your father did, I will give you long life. Then Solomon awoke and he realized it had been a dream. So what does God give him in response to his request? How was God pleased, firstly? How was he pleased about what Solomon says? That he asked for. Right. Yeah. Not only was he pleased what he asked for, he was pleased what he did not ask for. Right? He asked for this ability to discern right and wrong, not the long life, not to destroy enemy, for wealth, not for fame. I give you. And so what does he get back in return?
I find it interesting, Gary, that the way the text reads, it says that he asked for discernment in administering justice. To me, that has a legal connotation, not just this broad idea that we have of Solomon of being a wise man, but he's asking to administer justice.
And as Kevin just kind of brought up here, but the more of a judicial, legal, connotation, yeah. So we have translated this into wisdom, but the request basically is, tell me how to discern between right and wrong, good and evil. Now he gives him these three things he gives him. He gives him wisdom. He gives them eventually, we're going to see, wealth and fame, and he gives them long life. Now, between the three of those, one of those is different. Wisdom, he apparently gives him unconditionally, right? I'm going to make you the wisest person in the land. Wealth and fame, I'm going to make you wealthy. I'm going to make you the most powerful king ever to live, or at least during your lifetime, right? But the third thing he gives them is different. The third thing he gives them has conditions. What is that? What's the third thing and what is the condition? What's the third thing that God gives to Solomon, and what is the condition with it? He gives him long life, and what is the condition here? As long as you keep my decrees and commandments as David your father did, I will give you long life. So that one is different. That one comes with a condition. And we'll see how that plays out later on. But of the three things, the first two, here you go. Third one is, so long as you follow the rules, we'll give you a long life as well. Do as your father did.
Was King Solomon the one that asked God for, when he asked him, what do you ask of me to lead his people? He said he just wants the wisdom.
He asks for a discerning heart. He asks to be able to figure out between right and wrong, good and evil. Okay? So after this dream, he returned to Jerusalem. He stood before the ark of the Lord, sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, gives all a big feast. But there's no magical change in him, is there? He's still the same guy. He wakes up from the dream. There's no, glow about him. He doesn't, when we've seen people earlier in the Bible when they have talks with God, that there's some kind of new aura about them, that there's a change. Here it's very subtle. There's no transformation. God here, and in Proverbs 2, it says, God will give you wisdom, but you must ask for it. That's something we're going to learn here. So by all means, ask. James says in chapter 1, ask for wisdom. Ask for help from God. So there's no magical transformation. Just seek it, and it will be given to you. But what is different now about Solomon? Anything? Before you answer that, I want to make sure we understand. He's not necessarily given knowledge. I think there's a big difference between knowledge and wisdom, right? He doesn't automatically know everything. He's not the all-knowing person any longer. He's not the one who writes the encyclopedias. He's not the one who understands that the earth is not flat, right? He doesn't have all knowledge, but wisdom. And I want you to understand the difference between the two. He's not the smartest man in the world anymore. Maybe he's the best judge. Okay, did I step on your toes? Kevin, you had a question? Okay, all right.
So you're saying, how do you want to answer that? You say, what are the conditions? Like, was he was humble, he was merciful, or he was just a good king, or
The-
he wanted to be obedient, he loved God, or what was the course and the condition?
The condition for long life was to follow the commandments and to follow God's will. Okay? So now, Solomon, what does Solomon have? He knew some things, and he knew just that everybody desires something. Everybody desires something, right? And all of our actions basically flow out of what we desire. And when we're forced to choose, everyone will give up what they desire to gain what they desire most. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So he uses those concepts in administering this wisdom. So let's look at the famous story starting in verse 16. Now 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. One of them said, "Pardon me, my lord. This woman and I live in the same house, and I had a baby while she was there with me. The 3rd day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were left alone. There was no one in the house but the 2 of us. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while I, your servant, was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. The next morning I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that he wasn't the son I'd born." The other woman had said, "No, the living one is my son, the dead one is yours." But the first one insisted, "No, the dead one is yours, the living one is mine." And so they argued before the king. The king said, "This one says my son is alive and your son is dead. Well, that one says, no, your son is dead and mine is alive." So the king said, "Bring me a sword." So they brought a sword for the king. He gave an order, "Cut the living child in 2 and give half to one, half to the other." The woman whose son was alive was deeply moved out of love for her son and said to the king, "Please, my lord, give her the living baby, don't kill him." But the other said, "Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in 2. Then the king gave his ruling. "Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother." When all Israel heard of the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. So what is he looking at between the 2 people? Does he have greater knowledge? Was he able to run a DNA test to see who it was, or a paternity test or blood test? He's making observations of the 2 people, right? The 2 mothers. He's not really actually able to determine who the mother of the child is he? But he can make some observations. Now, chopping the baby in half, does that really reveal the true mother? And if you can imagine the people around, the shock of the onlookers that this is a decision that this king is going to be making here, right? Sometimes we see God's judgment test us in some really strange ways.
Now, we do realize that there are people that don't have legs, arms, and have half a body, and they still live. But cutting this child in half, to me, that we can understand, or born with 2 heads or 2 stomachs or whatever the kid is born with. But this would have probably just murdered this child.
Yeah, I expect the baby would have been dead, yeah.
Is that King Solomon, the woman that rolled over on the child and killed it, it's like she's devious or envious, or she doesn't really care. If I can't have it, then it's like you can't have it, which we sometimes think.
Yep.
But the thing of it is, the woman who did love and knew that this was her child, I'd rather see my child grow up with this woman who is not the mother than to see it cut in half, and that's how we make this
Sure.
decision.
And we still,
Of
yeah.
one over the other says.
And we still don't really know who the mother is. But Solomon was able to figure out, I don't even care if this is the right mother, but this is the person who's going to take care of and love this child, right? That was the decision. Whether she was the biological mother of this child didn't matter to him, but because of the actions of the 2, this person should get the child instead of this person, right? So after this, things go from there. And after this, people started coming from all over, looking for the wisdom of Solomon. And we're not technically studying this, but in chapter 4, it kind of goes about the details of Solomon's wisdom. In verses 29, it starts, "And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and the breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than all other men. His fame was all in the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that's in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke of beasts, of birds, of reptiles, of fish. And people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So he uses this wisdom and starts developing wealth, knowledge. He starts developing other things, right? He becomes wealthy. He develops his wealth here. And so we're going to skip over now to chapter 10. We'll talk about the wealth of Solomon. And when the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and his relationship to the Lord, she came to test Solomon with hard questions. She came arriving at Jerusalem with a great caravan with camels carrying spices and large quantities of gold and precious stones. She came to Solomon and talked with him about all that she had on her mind. Now, Sheba was a part of Yemen, what is now modern-day Yemen, was 1,500 miles away from where Solomon was. And she had that far away had heard the fame of and wisdom of Solomon. And it was interesting in here that this relationship, this wisdom relationship, she understood came from the Lord. She was overwhelmed with his wisdom. She brings these gifts to a person she hadn't seen yet before. Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. When the queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom Solomon had built, and the palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of the officials, the attending servants in robes, his cupbearers, the burnt offerings he made, she was overwhelmed. So here we have this queen of Sheba comes to here. She gives him all these things. She's impressed from so far away. She said to the king, "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true. I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told to me. In wisdom and wealth, you have far exceeded the report I heard. How happy your people must be." And then down to 10, and she gave the king 120 talents of gold, large quantities of spices and precious stones. Never again were so many spices brought in as those the queen of Sheba gave to the king of Solomon. King Solomon gave the queen of Sheba all she desired and asked for her, besides what she had given her out of her royal bounty. Then she left and returned with her retinue to her own country. So we start to see, because of this wisdom provided by the Lord, he's becoming wealthier and wealthier. And then in 14, the weight of the gold that Solomon reached yearly was 666 talents, not including the revenues from merchants and traders from all the Arabian kings and the governors of the territories. 666. Only one other time that's used here. We'll see that again in Revelations, right? And when we talk about these talents, 666 talents in 2015 would have been $1 billion. So we're talking 666 talents is a lot of money, okay? So he became very, very, very wealthy. Yeah.
With this wealth back in their time, and I'm kind of thinking right and shared it with his people. Did King Solomon do this? I mean, does it say whether did he help the poor? Did he feed the hungry? Did he open his doors to do anything except sit on the throne to be king?
Well, I don't believe that it was a socialist state where everybody shared in the wealth, okay? But right now, the kingdom is happy and thriving at this point. So some parts of that are going to be trickling down, so to speak. But he was wealthy, and that doesn't mean you were wealthy, okay?
Just a comment
Yeah.
real quick here to kind of maybe answer her question. Later on, when we see the revolt of the kingdom and Jeroboam becomes king of the 10 northern tribes, some scholars speculate that one of the reasons for that revolt was because of Solomon's high levels of taxation of the people and the oppressive labor that he had put them under to build all of his projects. So was he sharing his wealth?
yeah.
In my opinion, no,
Yeah.
he was not sharing his wealth. He was oppressing the people.
And according to the movies, we're still looking for these King Solomon's riches, right? Yeah, that's right. We're still looking for those. Eric.
Put a plug in for in 2 weeks, and like Jerry said, a big part of the problem there. The tribes didn't really get along all that way.
Yeah.
You know, there was a lot of feeling, the fact that Benjamin was now not the tribe of the kings, but it now switched to Judah, tended to alienate a lot of the northern kingdoms.
And continuing along that line, and I wasn't going to get into this, but if you look at the rest of this section of it afterwards, we kind of see some of the things he did with the money. You know, he takes and he builds 200 large shields of hammered gold. Obviously, that is not something that helps out the normal person, okay? A shield in today's value would be worth about $250,000 per shield. So we can see that, you know, that's not going to help the middle class, okay? There was, you know, so much money there, but it was, you know, it was done with things that were kind of foolish. So at this point, we have this huge amounts of money, and he gets all this by being wise, and we assume that people had come to him to settle some differences and to pontificate about things and to settle some differences. But at the same time, as we just have talked about, maybe he's not being so wise here. Maybe instead of doing the things that are going to keep the kingdom rolling along, he's gathering all this wealth. And why would he be gathering all this wealth if he's the wise old man that we're thinking about? If he's following God's direction that we're thinking about? What is the need for this wealth? Why is he charging? Is he charging for these deals? Is he charging for people to come here to listen to him pontificate? Is he charging these kings to come in here? Is it all freely given? And at some point, you know, he's becoming so powerful that maybe the other ones are just worried that, you know, we have to go give tribute to the king here, or we're going to be in some serious trouble. So, you know, things start to change. And then starting in let's move on to chapter 11. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. Now, before I get any further, he'd already had wives before he married Pharaoh's daughter. We talked about that at the very beginning today. He starts off with marrying Pharaoh's daughter. He'd been married before that, and we know that because his child ends up being older than this marriage would have been. So he'd been married before. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonites, Hittites, they were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray.
Okay, what's the difference in concubines and wives?
It is a lover, a live-in lover, basically, a harem, okay?
Okay.
They weren't married, but he still would. They were not married, yeah. Yeah. Correct, right. Concubines had no standing, yeah. The children, generally no, but we do see from time to time that is not correct, but generally, yes, that is correct. So we learned long ago, back in Genesis, how God feels about this intermarriage, right? Don't do it. Why not? What's wrong with that? And we have the same issue. We have the same issues today, right? We have the same issues with intermarriage in all kinds of situations. And what are some of the problems with it?
My first thought was jealousy.
Okay. Okay. Why does God tell us not to do it? And he tells us right here.
Because of, you said, why does God not want you to marry?
Correct. What's wrong with intermarriage? Right.
If you marry a woman that is, serving God, but if you marry someone who is not, then they're going to pull you away.
Men think about the control that the women have over you already. Women can think of the control you have over the men. Multiply that by 700 now, right?
Well, Paul told us that I wrote that you didn't get married because you always look to God for whatever you want. But if you get married, then the first thing you got to do, you got to look to your wife for your children. And you take your eyes off him more so, which he doesn't want you to do because our God, of course, is a jealous God. And thou shalt have no other God before me.
Right. So we saw in the past, and when we discussed the Abraham story, when we discussed the Jacob story, when all of the times where the intermarriage of the people starts to cause problems. And we're going to see that here as well, because those wives could have either, one, become God-fearing, or more likely, because they weren't children, basically, they had their own God. So they would have their own, statues and idols and that kind of thing that they would continue to secretly worship. So we can see that when Solomon would see these things, he's going to start thinking, well, maybe they're right. Maybe what?
I think, Gary, it's important to understand that all of these women are not really tied up in sexual gratification. These women are more aligned with political and economic alliances and not sexual motivation.
Right. The women are certainly not. Right. Those were political marriages, right? But what is Solomon? Yeah.
To go with what Jerry said, and this may be said a little hard to hear. He would marry women, the daughters,
Kings, yeah.
Steal,
Right.
you're going to get along, so I'm going to marry your daughter.
Right. So what does he do here that starts causing problems? As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father has done. He then goes on, he builds a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Moloch. He did the same for all of his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. So what I'm thinking here is that I think Solomon still was a believer in God, that he loved God, but he's also just recognizing there's other gods because his wives are there. And maybe he's doing this to please the wives. Maybe he's doing it because they've gotten involved. But he's saying there are other gods, obviously, by doing this, right? I don't think here he's saying, oh, my God is not right. He's just acknowledging, well, maybe there's more than one God. There are other gods out there. God says no to that, right? The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, and you've not kept up with my covenants and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but I will give it to him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So early on when I asked which of the three things that were given to him is conditional? Long life. And we're going to see here, and we're running short here, that because of this, what happens? Because of this breaking away from the Lord, breaking the commandments, what does God tell him he's going to do? Take it all away. I'm going to just take everything that you have. I'm going to take it away from you. You didn't do my most important, basic thing. I said, you can have all this if you do one thing. And you couldn't do it. You got greedy. You got more powerful. You couldn't listen to what you were doing. You lost sight of the one thing I told you about.
And that's what's going on in our country today. I mean, just went sour that way. That's the way I feel. That's my personal opinion. That, you know, we didn't do it the way it was supposed to, you know. Like they say, they're trying to tax, well, I just heard a little tidbit of it with Obama, where we're going to tax the more employed, the rich people, to help the indigent, the low income, those less fortunate, because they don't pay taxes like they should on the money that they acquire, and it's made our country of people, it's just devastation. It's a lot into that. I'm just taking that little tidbit, but yeah, we ain't done right to
Yeah. Yep. So in any event, at the very end, it talks about Solomon's death and his decline, okay? And I wanted to think about just for a second that David had continued to teach Solomon throughout his life about what he needed to do. Solomon knew God's promise. He knew what God's plan was. He knew the promise that had come from as early as Abraham. He knew about David's place in the kingdom. He couldn't stay faithful just one generation away. Just one generation couldn't stay faithful after the death of David. So we have all of this wealth and military power and prestige fall apart. The security of Israel, we have to understand, was not this wealth and power, but it rested in God's blessing. Without God's blessing, it couldn't survive. So God starts the division of the kingdom. Okay, so now next week, we're going to backtrack. We'll go back to 5 through 9, which will talk about the building of the temple. So we'll kind of go back around. So Solomon will still be here next week when we talk about that. We'll do books 5 through 9 next week. Okay? All right, thanks.